Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. I wake up every morning and wonder, is this still real? The days drag on, one blending into the other, a continuous loop of routine. The faint light from the window slips through the curtains, just enough to remind me that another day has arrived. But does it matter? It all feels the same. The same house. The same streets. The same conversations that lead nowhere. I am stuck in a loop, a cycle that repeats endlessly, with no escape in sight. I sit on the edge of my bed, my eyes scanning the room. Everything is in its place, yet nothing feels right. The quiet is almost oppressive, the air thick with stillness. It's a silence that doesn't bring peace, but a kind of suffocating weight. A silence that hangs in the corners, lurking, always present. My breath feels shallow, my chest tight. I stand up, the creak of the floorboards beneath my feet making the house seem even more alive, as if it's watching me. The kitchen smells faintly of stale coffee, a leftover reminder from yesterday's attempt at starting the day with purpose. I pour myself a cup, the sound of the coffee splashing into the mug too loud in the quiet room. I sip it, but the bitterness tastes like nothing. Just a dull sensation that fills the emptiness for a moment and then fades. I glance at the clock on the wall. It's only 8 in the morning, but I already feel like I've lived through 1,000 hours. The same thoughts cycle in my head, the same questions that never seem to get answered. What's the point of it all? A noise. Faint at first, but unmistakable. A soft tapping. It's coming from the living room. I freeze. The silence had been so complete, so absolute, that any sound, no matter how small, feels out of place, an intruder. I set the cup down on the counter with a trembling hand, my eyes moving toward the door. There it is again. Tap. 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 I can't bring myself to move. The house feels colder, the air thick with a strange tension that wasn't there moments ago. The tap is too rhythmic to be random. It's deliberate. Someone? Something? I swallow hard and step cautiously toward the living room. The floor creaks under my weight, each step amplified by the silence that presses in from all sides. My heart pounds in my chest, my thoughts scattered, and yet there's a nagging pull to keep going, to see what's there, even if I wish I could just disappear into the walls and never face it. The door to the living room is slightly ajar. I push it open, the hinges groaning in protest, and peer inside. Nothing. The room looks as it always does, the worn sofa by the window, the bookcase along the far wall, the flickering light outside casting a shadow through the glass. But the tapping is gone, replaced by something else. Something darker. I hesitate at the threshold. My mind is racing, every nerve on edge, but nothing in the room makes sense. Everything seems just wrong. Not overtly, but in a way that makes my skin crawl. The air feels thicker here, more oppressive. I step inside, the soft thud of my footfalls too loud in the eerie quiet. The room seems smaller than I remember, the walls closing in just a little, the shadows stretching unnaturally long. I move closer to the window, the faint light outside revealing dust particles floating in the air. A soft, indistinct whisper brushes my ears, too faint to make out the words, but clear enough to make my hair stand on end. For a moment, I wonder if I'm losing my mind. What is happening to me? I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me, something beyond the walls, beyond the light. I turn back toward the door, but the tapping starts again. Now louder, more insistent. Tap. 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 It's coming from the hallway, right outside the room. I spin around, my pulse quickening. The hallway is empty, but the noise, it's unmistakable. It's so close now, so real, like someone is standing just out of view, waiting for me to acknowledge them. But there's no one there. I take a step back, my mind racing, heart pounding, and as I turn to leave, I hear it. The soft sound of footsteps behind me. I don't have to look. I know. Something is there. I need to leave. To run. But where would I go? There's nowhere. There's nothing. Just this suffocating house, this suffocating existence. I close my eyes, take a deep breath, and step toward the door. As I pass through the threshold, the whispering stops, and the house falls back into its usual silence. But it's not the same. Something's changed. Something is different now. And I can't shake the feeling that this is just the beginning. I don't sleep well that night. The shadows in my room feel longer, the silence deeper. I close my eyes, trying to block out the gnawing feeling of being watched, but it doesn't go away. My mind races, my pulse pounding in my ears. Every creak of the house, every soft gust of wind outside, sends me into a state of heightened alertness. I sit up in bed, the covers tangled around my legs. The room is still dark, the only light coming from the thin sliver of moonlight filtering through the curtains. The ticking of the clock on the wall is the only sound, the rhythm soothing and maddening at the same time. I force myself to take a breath, to push away the growing panic. It's nothing. Just my mind playing tricks on me. But the tapping, the footsteps, the whispering, it's all too vivid. Too real. My mind is still wrapped in that moment, that feeling of being so very close to something I can't understand. Something I don't want to. I stand, my feet cold against the hardwood floor, and move toward the window. I pull back the curtains slightly, peering out into the night. The street below is empty, the houses across the road dark and lifeless. Nothing unusual. Nothing out of place. Still, the unease doesn't leave me. I return to the bed, the weight of the room pressing down on me. I need to get out of here. To leave this house, this place that feels more like a prison than a home. But where would I go? The world outside feels just as empty, just as hopeless. The morning comes, and the light that filters through the curtains seems even weaker than before. It's a dull, gray light, as if the sun itself has lost its strength. I feel exhausted, though I haven't slept, and I force myself to stand, to move through the motions of the day. The kitchen is still quiet. The coffee maker hums softly as I prepare my usual drink, but it doesn't taste the same. There's a metallic aftertaste that lingers in my mouth, a sign of something wrong. The tapping from yesterday doesn't feel so distant anymore. It's like it's still echoing in my mind, that rhythm haunting the back of my thoughts. I walk into the living room, my eyes scanning the familiar surroundings. The old furniture. The cracks in the walls. The fading curtains. The room looks the same, but everything feels off. It's like the air is thicker, the shadows darker. I don't know how to explain it, but I feel it deep in my bones. I sit on the couch, trying to steady myself, but then I hear it again. That tap. 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 I freeze, my heart racing. I look around, but there's no one here. The house is silent. I can't see anything that might be causing it, but it's there. Right in front of me. I stand quickly, my breath quickening. I need to leave. I need to get out of here. I grab my jacket, throwing it over my shoulders, and head for the door. But as I reach for the handle, I stop. The house is silent again. Too silent. There's something strange about this quiet, like it's waiting for something. Waiting for me to move, to do something. I can't shake the feeling that if I leave now, I won't be able to come back. I step away from the door, my hand trembling as I rest it on the doorknob. My mind spins, torn between wanting to escape and needing to stay. I look back at the living room, my gaze lingering on the empty space. The shadows seem to move just out of the corner of my eye, and I can't tell if it's my imagination or if something is really there. I turn and walk deeper into the house. The hallway feels narrower now, the walls closing in. The air is cold, and I feel a chill that sinks into my bones. The tapping starts again, but this time it's louder. Closer. It's coming from the other end of the hall. It's not just a noise anymore. It's a presence. A presence that's aware of me. I move toward it, despite every instinct telling me to run, to hide, to get away. I have to know what it is. What it wants. The hall feels endless, stretching farther than it should. The closer I get, the more oppressive the air becomes, thick with a heaviness that weighs on my chest. And then, just as I reach the end, I see it. A figure standing at the far end of the hall. It's shadowy, indistinct, but unmistakable. I freeze, my breath caught in my throat. The figure doesn't move. It just stands there, watching me. It's waiting. My heart races, and I feel the panic rise in my throat, but my legs won't move. I'm rooted to the spot, caught between the urge to run and the need to understand what's happening. I blink, and when I open my eyes, the figure is gone. I stand there in the darkness, trying to make sense of it, but the silence returns. Complete. Total. And then, from behind me, I hear the tapping again. I spin around so quickly I almost lose my balance. My pulse is thundering in my ears. The house is still, too still. The tapping, once loud and persistent, is now barely a whisper in the background. It feels as if the sound is coming from within me, vibrating through my chest rather than the walls of the house. I take a step back, but my feet feel heavy, like they're sinking into the floor. Every inch of me is screaming to leave, to escape this suffocating place, but my legs betray me. They won't move. I'm paralyzed. And then, I see it again. In the corner of the hallway, where the light from the cracked door barely reaches, a figure stands. It's not as clear as before, just a silhouette, but it's unmistakable. This time, it's closer. I don't know how it got there, or when, but it's there. Watching. The tapping has stopped, but the air is charged, electric, like before a storm. I should scream, but my throat is tight, constricted. The words won't come. My body is frozen, eyes locked on the figure as it takes a slow step toward me. Its movements are jerky, unnatural, as if its joints don't bend the right way. There's a faint creaking sound, like old wood groaning under pressure. I can feel it now, the weight of its presence, pressing in on me, choking me. My breath comes in shallow gasps, the air too thick to breathe. My eyes dart around the hallway, looking for a way out, but the walls seem to be closing in. The hallway that once seemed endless is now a narrow tunnel, its edges curving in toward me. I can't look away. Something about it holds me in place, some invisible force binding me to the spot. It steps closer again, its footfalls muffled by the thick carpet, and I feel a cold draft wash over me. I flinch, instinctively pulling my jacket tighter around me, but it doesn't help. The chill seeps into my bones. Then, without warning, it speaks. The voice is soft at first, barely a murmur, but it's unmistakably there. Why did you leave? The words hit me like a physical blow, and I stagger back, a wave of nausea washing over me. I didn't leave, did I? The figure's outline shifts, becoming clearer, and for the first time, I see its face, or what's left of it. It's almost human, but not quite. Its features are distorted, as if they've been stretched or pulled. The eyes are dark, hollow, the skin pale and uneven. But the worst part? The smile. It's wide, too wide, and it stretches unnaturally across its face. I waited, it says again, the voice now an eerie whisper that sends a shiver down my spine. I waited for you. I shake my head, struggling to force my legs to move, to take a step away from the figure, but it feels like I'm walking in slow motion. It's like the air around me is thickening, weighing me down. Every inch I move feels like I'm fighting through water. I need to leave. I need to get out. But I can't. The figure steps forward again, and this time, I can feel its presence close enough to touch. I hear its breath, or is it mine, ragged and shallow? The cold intensifies, and I feel a deep, oppressive pressure in my chest. Why did you leave me? It repeats, the question becoming a chant, a mantra, its voice twisting and warping in my mind. I stumble back, finally breaking free from the paralysis. My heart is racing, and I turn, running down the hallway. My feet barely touch the ground as I move, the pounding of my footsteps echoing in my ears, mixing with the whispers that follow me. I reach the door, my hand slamming against the doorknob, and I yank it open. The outside world is there, the dim light of the street lamps spilling into the hallway, but it feels wrong. Everything feels wrong. I step outside, the air cold and biting, but the relief is short-lived. The figure isn't behind me, it's beside me. I turn, eyes wide in disbelief, and see it standing in the yard, just beyond the porch light. You left me, it says again, but this time, it's not a question. It's an accusation. A promise. I blink, and it's gone. But the unease doesn't fade. The air still feels thick, heavy with something I can't explain. My hands are shaking, my chest tight, but I force myself to take a deep breath. The street is silent, the houses across the road dark and still. No one saw. No one heard. But I know what I felt. I know what's out there. And it's not done with me yet. I stand there, rooted to the spot, staring out at the empty street. The chill in the air wraps around me like a cold, invisible hand, gripping tighter with every passing second. The world outside feels too quiet, too still, as if everything is holding its breath. I wait for something, anything, to break the silence, but nothing comes. My eyes scan the yard again, searching for any sign of movement. The porch light flickers once, then goes out. The darkness in front of me seems to grow deeper, stretching toward me, pulling me back into the shadow. I take a step forward, then another. My feet feel heavy, like I'm wading through water, each movement requiring more effort than the last. It's as if the night is swallowing me whole. Just get inside, I whisper to myself, though I don't believe it. I don't trust the night anymore. I don't trust anything. But my legs move on their own, carrying me toward the door. My hand reaches for the handle, but before I can touch it, a soft sound breaks the silence, a voice, barely above a whisper. Don't leave. I freeze. The voice is familiar, but it's distorted, echoing in the space between my ears. It's coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It's the same voice I heard inside, the same voice that spoke to me in the hall. But it's different now. More insistent. More urgent. My heart pounds in my chest, and I turn slowly, afraid of what I might see. The figure is there again, standing in the yard, just outside the circle of light. Its form is more solid now, more defined. I can see the details, its twisted, pale face, the wide, unnatural grin that stretches far too wide, and the hollow, unblinking eyes that seem to pierce through me. It's watching me. Waiting. Why do you keep coming? I say aloud, though I'm not sure if I'm asking it or myself. The figure doesn't respond immediately. Instead, it tilts its head, its smile widening just a fraction. The silence stretches between us like a taut wire, vibrating with tension. Then, it speaks again, its voice low and rasping, barely more than a breath. Because you never listen. The words feel like a punch to my gut. I stumble back, the air growing colder with every breath, every word it speaks. My hands shake as I clutch the doorframe, trying to steady myself. I feel a surge of panic rising in my chest. My mind races. What does it mean? What does it want from me? I look around, desperate for an escape, but the street is empty. The houses across from me are dark, the windows black voids that seem to swallow the world around them. Please, just leave me alone, I beg, my voice shaking. I don't even recognize it, my voice strained and desperate. But the figure doesn't move. It doesn't speak. It just stands there, watching. I can feel the weight of its presence pushing down on me, making it hard to breathe. It's suffocating. Its gaze is like a hand, gripping my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. My feet won't move. I want to run, but I can't. The fear is too strong. The paralysis too real. The figure takes a step forward, and for the first time, I hear the faint sound of its breath. It's ragged, uneven, as if each inhale is a struggle. No. I whisper, my voice breaking. Please, don't come closer. It doesn't listen. Another step. Then another. I turn, scrambling to open the door, but it's stuck. The handle won't turn. My fingers slide over it, slick with sweat, my mind reeling. Why can't I open it? And then I feel it. A presence behind me. Cold breath against my neck. I spin around, and the figure is right there, standing only inches from me. Its grin is almost unbearable now, stretching so wide it seems to swallow its own face. The eyes are dark, voids that seem to pull everything into them, everything, including me. I try to scream, but nothing comes out. My body won't cooperate. You can't escape me, the figure whispers, its voice slithering into my mind. Not now. Not ever. The air around me grows thick, dense with something that's suffocating. The world tilts, and I feel myself falling. Not physically, but mentally, like the ground beneath me is crumbling away. I close my eyes, hoping it will go away, hoping this is all a nightmare, but when I open them again, nothing has changed. It's still there, right in front of me. You will remember, it says softly, almost kindly. You will remember everything. And suddenly, I do. Flashes of memories crash into me, moments I've long forgotten, faces I've tried to erase from my mind. The figure in front of me is not just a shadow. It is everything I've left behind, everything I've tried to forget. The guilt, the mistakes, the people I've hurt. The figure isn't just here to torment me. It's here to remind me, to show me everything I've done. And I know, deep down, that it will never stop. The memories hit me like a flood, relentless and overwhelming. Faces, voices, fragments of my past I had buried so deep they no longer felt like mine. They're all here now, rushing at me, crashing through my mind with no mercy. The figure watches me, its twisted smile never faltering. Its eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, seem to swallow everything I am, everything I've ever been. I can feel my body trembling, not from the cold, but from something far worse, the weight of the truth, the weight of my own guilt. You can't run from this, it whispers, its voice so soft it might almost be comforting if it weren't so terrifying. It's already inside you. I want to scream. I want to tear myself away from this nightmare, from this thing that knows my every fear, my every regret. But I can't. My body feels like it's been chained to the spot, every movement slow and impossible. It leans closer, its breath cold against my skin. I can't breathe. I can't think. All I can feel is its presence, pressing in on me, suffocating me. And then, in the distance, I hear something. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, footsteps. They're coming closer, but they're not mine. They don't belong to me. The sound is steady, deliberate, like someone is walking toward me with purpose. The figure in front of me doesn't seem to notice. Its gaze is fixed on me, its smile growing even wider. The footsteps grow louder, closer. And then, just as I think I can't take any more of this, I hear a voice. It's faint at first, but it's unmistakable. A familiar voice, my voice. I'm here. The words pull me from the paralysis, just for a moment, just enough to make me realize that I'm not alone. I whip my head toward the sound, desperate for any sign of life, any sign that I can escape this nightmare. There, standing in the doorway, is a figure. Not the one that haunts me, but something different. A person. A memory. It's me. Younger, but unmistakably me. Come on, the younger version of myself says, her voice steady, comforting. We have to go. You can't stay here. I try to move, try to reach out to her, but the figure in front of me isn't done yet. It steps forward, its footfalls so heavy that the ground shakes beneath me. No, I whisper, barely able to speak. No, I don't want to. You can't escape, the figure hisses, its voice low and twisted. You never will. But the younger version of me doesn't flinch. She doesn't hesitate. She just keeps walking toward me, her hand outstretched. Please, I beg. Please help me. The air around me grows colder, colder than I thought possible, and for a moment, I think I'll freeze. The figure is still close now, its presence almost suffocating, but the girl keeps moving forward, her hand reaching closer. And then, as if time has slowed down, the figure suddenly lunges. It's fast, faster than I can react. I feel its cold grip on my wrist, its fingers digging into my skin like ice, pulling me away from the girl. I scream, but no sound escapes my mouth. The girl is gone, vanished like smoke in the wind. The figure pulls me backward, dragging me through the yard, through the darkness, its laugh echoing in my mind, in my ears, growing louder, more mocking. "You're mine now," it says, its voice more familiar than ever. "And you always will be." The world around me seems to spin, twisting and warping like a painting on fire. The grass beneath me turns black, the trees contort into grotesque shapes, and the sky above is an unnatural shade of red. I can't breathe. I can't escape. But through it all, the one thing that remains unchanged is the figure's smile, wide, twisted, and all-encompassing. And then, just as quickly as it began, everything goes silent. The world stops spinning, the air stills, and the figure is gone. The yard is just a yard again. The houses across the street are dark, the streetlights flicker. I fall to my knees, gasping for air. I don't know how long I've been here, in this nightmare that feels more real than anything else. My heart is pounding in my chest, my hands shaking. I look around, but I don't see the figure. It's gone. The house, the yard, everything is still. I'm alone. But I know, deep down, that I will never be alone again. The memories, my mistakes, my regrets, they're with me. They always have been. And no matter where I go, no matter what I do, that figure will always be there, watching, waiting. It's never over. It never will be. It started with a question that never seemed to have an answer. Am I really alone? I had lived in the city for years. The familiar skyline, the constant hum of traffic, and the soft glow of streetlights were all I had ever known. But lately, something had changed. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something watching, waiting. Every night, as I walked through the quiet streets, the feeling would creep over me. It started as a vague sense, like a whisper at the edge of my consciousness, a soft tug in the back of my mind. But it grew, slowly, until it was all I could think about. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just stress from work, or maybe the isolation of city life. But every step I took seemed to echo in the empty streets, every shadow a little too deep, every rustle of leaves a little too deliberate. One evening, I was walking home after a late shift, the streets empty except for the occasional flicker of a passing car. The cold air bit at my skin, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. I wasn't far from my apartment, just a few more blocks to go, but something felt off. The usual comfort of the city was gone. It felt like a different place altogether, like a mask had slipped, revealing something far darker. I quickened my pace, but I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. The feeling of eyes on my back, cold and unblinking, was suffocating. I glanced over my shoulder, but the street was empty, just a few dim lights and long shadows stretching across the pavement. Then, I heard it. A soft sound, like a footstep in the distance, just at the edge of my hearing. I stopped, my heart pounding. I waited. The street was silent again, but the feeling remained. I wasn't imagining it. Someone, or something, was out there. I took a few cautious steps forward, trying to ignore the way my skin prickled with fear. The sound came again, closer this time. A shuffle, followed by another step. My pulse quickened. I spun around, but there was nothing behind me. Just the empty street and the quiet hum of the city. I cursed under my breath, trying to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks. Maybe the shadows were just a little too deep tonight. Maybe I was just tired. But the footsteps persisted, growing closer with each passing moment. I broke into a run. The cold air whipped against my face as I sprinted down the street, but I could still hear the footsteps behind me, following my every move. I turned a corner, my feet pounding against the pavement, but no matter how fast I ran, the sound was always there, just a beat behind. I rounded another corner, desperately looking for a safe place, somewhere I could catch my breath. But when I looked up, I froze. At the end of the alley stood a figure, tall, dark, and unmoving. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unblinking. I stood there, paralyzed, my heart pounding in my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and run, but I couldn't move. The figure took a slow step forward, the sound of its footsteps somehow louder now, echoing in the alley. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I turned and fled, not daring to look back. The sound of footsteps followed, relentless and unforgiving. I didn't stop running until I reached my apartment building. I slammed the door behind me, locking it with shaking hands. I pressed my back against the door, gasping for breath. For a moment, the silence was deafening. But then, just as I thought I could breathe again, I heard it. A soft tapping, barely audible, coming from the other side of the door. I held my breath, my body frozen in place. The tapping came again, slower this time, like someone testing the door. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence returned, heavy and suffocating. But I knew something was waiting for me in the shadows. And no matter how many doors I locked, how many walls I built, I couldn't escape it. I was being watched. I stayed awake that night, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. The room felt too small, too suffocating, as if the very walls were closing in on me. I couldn't even remember falling asleep, but when I woke up, the first thing I noticed was the silence, unnatural, thick silence that seemed to press against my ears. The tapping had stopped, but something else had replaced it. A low hum. A faint vibration that I could feel in the air itself, like the faintest pulse of a distant heartbeat. It came from somewhere deep within the building, but it was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. My instincts told me it wasn't right. It wasn't normal. I tried to ignore it, to chalk it up to my mind playing tricks after the terror of the night before. But deep down, I knew it was something more. I pushed myself out of bed and walked toward the window, pulling aside the heavy curtains. The city stretched out before me, as empty as ever, the streets bathed in the sickly yellow glow of streetlights. No sign of the figure. No sign of anything that could explain what I had felt. I exhaled slowly, trying to calm myself. But the hum didn't stop. It lingered in the background, like a low drone, always there but just out of reach, as if it was tied to the building itself. I didn't know what to do. I had to leave the apartment, get some air. The city felt safer, somehow. I grabbed my coat and stepped into the hallway, the familiar walls of my building feeling suddenly unfamiliar. The hallway, usually mundane and boring, now seemed oddly oppressive, the lights flickering overhead. The air felt colder, too. I moved toward the stairs, but halfway there, I heard it again. A shuffle. A movement in the shadows. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound came from around the corner, like someone, or something, was pacing, waiting. I called out weakly. "Hello?" No answer. A surge of panic rose within me, but I forced myself to move. My feet felt heavy as I inched forward, trying to peer around the corner without getting too close. The silence was unbearable. It felt as though something, or someone, was waiting for me to make the first move. My heart was in my throat as I stepped around the corner. And there it was. A figure, standing at the far end of the hallway. Not as tall as the one I had seen the night before, but still imposing in its stillness. The shadows seemed to wrap around it, hiding its face, its body. I could feel its presence more than see it. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge me. It was as though it had been waiting there, just outside my perception, until I had dared to step into its sight. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice shaking despite my best efforts. There was no response. The figure remained motionless. Something in me broke. I couldn't stand it any longer. I turned and ran, not caring where I was going, only that I had to get away from that thing. My footfalls echoed down the hallway, the only sound in the oppressive silence. I burst through the stairwell door, but when I reached the bottom, the door behind me slammed shut with a force that shook the building. I turned back, terrified, but there was nothing. No figure. No sign of movement. Just the same dull hum in the air. I checked the time. Morning had broken, but it felt like I had been walking in circles for hours. I ran outside, the cold air hitting me like a shock. I couldn't stay inside, couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lurking just beyond my line of sight. I walked the streets, trying to clear my mind, but the further I went, the more the world around me felt distorted. The city's skyline seemed to stretch in unnatural ways, the shadows too long, the streets too narrow. I knew something was wrong. As I passed a corner, I heard it again, the shuffling sound, faint but unmistakable. I spun around, but there was no one. Just the empty street. But the hum, the pulse of energy, was still there, running through the very ground beneath my feet. I began to run again, faster this time, until I reached the park. I stopped by a bench, leaning against the cold stone, breathing heavily. I tried to calm myself, tried to make sense of the madness. And that's when I saw it. In the distance, standing in the middle of the park, was the same figure. The one I had seen in the hallway. Its head was tilted slightly, as though it were studying me. There was no mistaking it. It was real. I didn't know what to do. There was nowhere to hide, no escape. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, the figure turned and walked into the shadows, disappearing into the night like a wisp of smoke. The city felt colder than ever, and I was no longer sure if the things I was seeing were real. Were they in my mind? Was I losing my grip on reality? Or was something truly watching me, following my every move? All I knew was that I couldn't trust my own eyes anymore. The figure was real, or at least, it felt real. And it was out there, watching. I spent the next few days trying to convince myself that I had imagined it. That the figure, the hum, the shadows, everything was just the result of stress, sleeplessness, or some deep-seated anxiety I hadn't dealt with. But no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I returned to my apartment, hoping the familiar surroundings would offer some comfort. But as soon as I stepped inside, I felt it again, the weight of being watched. The air was heavier than it should have been. The silence was too thick. My apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. I couldn't sit still, pacing back and forth in my living room, my eyes flickering nervously to the windows, the doors, the shadows. I could still hear that hum, faint but persistent, pulsing in the background, just beyond the edge of my awareness. It was as if the building itself was alive, breathing, waiting. It wasn't just my apartment. The entire city felt wrong now. Even the streets outside, which I had once found comforting, now seemed like a maze, each turn taking me further away from reality. People went about their business, oblivious to the weight of the world pressing down on me. I was beginning to doubt if anyone else could feel it, or if it was just me. That night, I went for a walk, needing to clear my head. I found myself drawn back to the park, the place where I had seen the figure. The place where everything had changed. I didn't want to go back, but at the same time, I couldn't resist. As I walked along the darkened path, I noticed how different the park felt now. The trees seemed taller, their branches twisting in unnatural shapes, their shadows stretching across the ground in ways that defied logic. The faint hum, that persistent vibration, was still there, threading through the silence, making my skin crawl. I paused by the bench, the same one where I had stopped before. But this time, I didn't feel the cold stone beneath me. Instead, I felt something warm, something slick, almost like wet leather. I jumped back, heart racing, and looked down. There, at the foot of the bench, was a trail of footprints. Dark, wet, and unnatural. They led into the shadows, just beyond the trees. I couldn't make out where they came from or where they went. A chill ran down my spine, and my heart pounded in my chest. I took a hesitant step forward, unable to stop myself. I was drawn to the footprints, as if something, or someone, was pulling me toward them. But just as I was about to follow the trail, I heard it again. The shuffle. The unmistakable sound of movement, but this time it was closer. Too close. I turned, panic rising in my chest, but the park was empty. No one in sight. No figure. No sound. Just the faint hum in the background, reverberating through the trees, through the air, into my very bones. I backed away from the bench, my mind racing. What was happening to me? Why couldn't I escape this feeling? Why did it feel like I was being drawn deeper into something I couldn't understand? Suddenly, the hum grew louder, more intense, until it felt like it was vibrating in my skull. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I saw something moving in the corner of my eye. A shadow, flickering, stretching unnaturally. I blinked, and it was gone. I didn't wait to see if it came back. I ran. I ran through the park, through the streets, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the sound of my footsteps pounding against the pavement. I didn't stop until I was back at my apartment, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my keys. Once inside, I slammed the door behind me, pressing my back against it as if that would keep whatever was following me out. I slid down to the floor, my chest tight, gasping for air. My mind raced, desperately searching for an explanation. But there was no explanation. The shadows were real. The hum was real. The figure, the one I had seen in the hallway in the park, it was real. It was there, watching, waiting. I couldn't escape. It was in the city. It was in my apartment. It was inside my head. As I sat there on the floor, trying to steady my breath, I noticed something strange. On the wall in front of me, a shadow seemed to shift, to move, just out of the corner of my eye. But when I looked directly at it, it was gone. I rubbed my eyes, trying to calm myself, but when I looked back, the shadow was there again. Larger this time. Closer. I didn't move. I couldn't. I just stared at it, feeling my heartbeat quicken. The shadow was taking shape, dark, unnatural, like a figure emerging from the wall itself. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. And then I heard it. A voice. Soft, almost a whisper, but clear enough to make my blood run cold. "You can't hide from me." I froze, my blood running cold at the sound of that voice. It wasn't like a normal whisper, though. It was almost familiar, but distorted, like something trying to mimic the human sound but not quite getting it right. The air seemed to thicken around me, pressing in from all sides, and my mind was spiraling with questions. Who was that? What was that? The shadow on the wall hadn't moved, but its presence seemed to swell, its edges shifting unnaturally, stretching like it was alive. My chest tightened with a terror I couldn't escape. I was trapped. I forced myself to look away from the shadow, focusing on the room around me. The silence was suffocating now, pressing in with a weight I couldn't shake. I felt like I was being watched from every corner, every crack. My eyes darted over the room, half expecting to see that same presence standing there in the corner, waiting for me to slip up. But it wasn't just the shadows, it was the very space itself. Every inch of the room felt wrong. The hum was louder now, not just vibrating in my ears, but in the very walls. It was as if the building had become an extension of the thing stalking me, as if the boundaries between reality and the thing that wasn't real were beginning to blur. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the noise, the pressure, the suffocating feeling. When I opened them again, I could swear the room had changed. The walls seemed to breathe with a slow, rhythmic pulse, as if something beneath the surface was alive, stretching and pulling. The furniture, too, had shifted in the dim light, nothing obvious, but subtle. The chair by the window was now angled just slightly differently. A shadow had crept along the floor where it hadn't been before. It wasn't just my imagination. It couldn't be. I took a step back, and my foot hit something. I turned sharply, and there it was, an old photograph I didn't remember having. It was face down on the floor, edges curled from the years. I bent down to pick it up, my heart pounding in my chest, but as I turned it over, I felt a wave of nausea crash over me. The photo was of me, but it wasn't from any moment I could recall. It was taken in a place I didn't recognize, a building with tall, Gothic arches, a long, shadowed hallway. I was standing in front of it, my face pale, my eyes wide with something. Fear? I couldn't tell. The strangest part? There was someone else in the picture, just behind me. But they weren't facing the camera. They were facing away, their face obscured by the shadows, the shape of their body blurred and distorted. I felt a sickening lurch in my stomach. Had this photo been here the whole time? Or had it appeared just now? The room felt suffocating again, like the very air had thickened and frozen in place. I had to leave. I had to get out. I couldn't stay here anymore. But as I moved toward the door, a terrible thought stopped me cold. What if I couldn't leave? What if that shadow, that hum, was following me? What if I stepped out into the world, only to find that it wasn't just my apartment, my building, it was everything? The city? The world? What if I was already trapped in it? I reached for the door, and my hand shook as it touched the handle. For a moment, I thought I heard something. A faint scraping noise. Like something dragging across the floor, behind me, just out of view. My breath caught in my throat. I turned quickly, panic surging through me, but the room was still. The shadows were still. The photo was still clutched in my hand. Then I saw it. The doorframe, just above my head, was cracked open. A thin sliver of light was escaping through the gap, casting an eerie glow over the walls. It hadn't been like that before. The door had been closed, locked. I was sure of it. Something, or someone, was inside with me. I backed away slowly, my mind racing with possibilities. My heart was a drum in my chest, beating harder with every passing second. The scraping sound grew louder, closer. I could feel it now. The presence. It wasn't just in the room. It was inside me, pressing in. Suddenly, there was a flash of movement in the corner of my eye, and I turned just in time to see someone, dart across the room, right behind me. I whipped around, but nothing was there. Just the faint rustling of the wind through the open window. But I knew. It was here. Whatever it was in my apartment. I couldn't stay. I needed to get out. I grabbed my coat, my keys, and slammed the door behind me. The hallway was dark, the air thick with tension. But even as I stepped into the building's corridor, I felt it, an oppressive weight in the air, like being watched by something unseen. The hum. That faint, dissonant hum, like the very walls were singing a lullaby of dread. It was getting louder. Closer. I moved down the stairs quickly, my mind spinning with one terrifying thought after another. What if I was never meant to leave? What if this wasn't just the apartment? What if it was everything? A slow, creeping nightmare that was now swallowing the world? And then, just as I reached the front door, the hum stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. So deep, so unnatural, that it made my skin crawl. I hesitated, my hand on the door handle, unsure of what awaited me on the other side. Would I step out into the night, or would I step into something much worse? And then, just as I was about to turn the handle, I heard it again. A voice. This time, it was clearer. You can't escape me. I froze. The door handle twisted in my hand as if being pulled from the other side. The voice echoed in my head, sharper this time, like it was threading itself into my very thoughts. You can't escape me. The words hung in the air, heavy, suffocating. I pressed my hand harder against the door, but it wouldn't open. The handle twisted again, with a force that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the walls. The apartment behind me was silent, but I knew the shadow, whatever it was waiting. Was it real? Was it all in my head? I took a step back, my breath shallow. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't move. The hallway was dark, the edges of the shadows now deeper, curling in on themselves. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the walls were slowly closing in. The door handle twisted again, and then, the sound of it scraping, grating against the frame, filled the silence. A small crack of light came from the outside, barely visible, like a sliver of hope, but I wasn't sure it was enough to hold back the thing that had been following me. My thoughts raced. I should have run. I should have slammed the door shut, locked it again, done something. But I couldn't. My legs felt like they were made of stone, glued to the floor. The strange hum, the whispering presence, it had become part of me now. Suddenly, there was a soft thud. Not from behind me. Not from the door. From above. I glanced up, my heart leaping into my throat, and for a split second, I saw it, a shadow stretching across the ceiling. It wasn't right. It was wrong. The shape twisted, distorted like a hand reaching down from the darkness. It didn't belong. I wanted to scream, to turn and run, but my voice was trapped in my throat. My pulse was a drumbeat in my ears, and the air itself seemed to grow thicker, like it was suffocating me. The light from the crack in the door grew brighter, but something about it was wrong. It wasn't a beacon. It was a trap. I felt it then, a sudden, overwhelming presence behind me. I wasn't alone. No, I hadn't been alone for a long time. Not since the moment I stepped into this nightmare. I could feel it, something just behind me, a breath on the back of my neck, cold and ragged. The shadow, no, it was more than that. It was alive, moving, pulsating with an energy I couldn't comprehend. It moved closer, inching toward me with a low, ominous hum. I finally turned, forcing my legs to move. My hand shot out to grasp the door again, to open it, to escape whatever waited beyond it. But as my fingers touched the handle, it gave way, too easily. I froze. I should have felt relief. I should have felt something other than terror. But instead, I felt the weight of everything pressed down on me. The door opened with a soft creak, and I could see beyond it. The hallway stretched on, but it wasn't the same hallway. The walls were cracked, stained with something dark. The floorboards were warped, bowing under the weight of some unseen force. The air smelled thick, like mildew and decay. And the shadows? They weren't shadows anymore. They were shapes, living things, creeping along the walls, slithering across the floor like something waiting to pounce. And there, at the end of the hall, standing at the entrance to the stairs, was the figure. The one from the photograph. The one I had never seen before but had always known. It didn't move. Not at first. It just stood there, watching me. Its form was human, but the edges, the way the light bent around it, weren't right. It was blurry, incomplete, like something was trying to fill in the gaps of its existence. But its eyes, they were piercing. They weren't human eyes. They were something worse, something older, something that should never have been. They seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, and they saw me, every inch of me, every hidden part of me, everything I had tried to bury. It was as though it could see straight through me, into the very depths of my soul. I couldn't move. My body was locked in place, my breath caught in my throat. And then it spoke. You shouldn't have come back. Its voice was like the whisper from before, but this time it was louder, clearer. It was the sound of something ancient, something far older than the world I knew. It wasn't trying to frighten me, it knew it had already succeeded. I could feel the ground beneath me shift, trembling. The apartment, the entire building, it was alive now, pulsing with that same dark energy that had followed me here. The walls felt like they were closing in on me. I had to do something. I had to move. I turned and fled. I sprinted down the stairs, but the deeper I went, the more the darkness pressed in, as if the building was swallowing me whole. The hum in my ears grew louder, vibrating in my skull. The shadows on the walls twisted, reaching toward me, closing in. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I reached the lobby, gasping for air, and the door to the street was right there. I pulled on the handle, praying that it was still real, that I could escape. But as the door swung open, the light from outside wasn't the same. It was wrong. The streets were darker than I remembered, the air heavier. It felt like I had stepped into a different world, one where nothing was as it should be. I had escaped the apartment, but had I really escaped? The door slammed shut behind me with a deafening thud, and the world around me began to distort, the edges blurring like smoke. The shadows were still there, and I knew, deep down, that whatever I had left behind wasn't done with me yet. It started with a single question: what if I wasn't supposed to find this place? I had been walking through the dense forest that surrounded the old, crumbling town I had recently moved to. The trees loomed tall, their twisted branches like gnarled hands reaching out to the sky, their trunks scarred with time. The wind had a strange chill to it, more biting than it should have been for early autumn. A heavy, oppressive silence hung in the air, broken only by the occasional creak of a branch or the rustling of leaves beneath my feet. I wasn't a stranger to wandering these woods. They felt like a refuge, a place to clear my mind. But today, something felt different. The usual peace had been replaced by a nagging sense of being watched. Every step I took seemed too loud, too deliberate, as if the earth beneath me was aware of my presence. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Not in the way I was used to, at least. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. After all, I had been through enough trauma to know that the mind can be a fragile thing. But the feeling wouldn't leave. Then, as I pushed further into the woods, I found it. It was a clearing I had never seen before. A circle of trees, their bark so blackened that it almost seemed to absorb the light around them. The ground was uneven, as if something had once been here, something that had been torn away, leaving only traces behind. And that's when I saw the symbols. Carved deep into the ground were intricate, swirling designs, arranged in a pattern I couldn't immediately make sense of. Some were simple, others twisted into shapes that felt wrong, unnatural. They weren't the kinds of marks one would find from animals or a wandering hiker. No, these were deliberate, ritualistic. My heart began to race. My breath caught in my throat as my eyes traced the patterns. I didn't know why, but I knew then that I had stumbled upon something I shouldn't have. These symbols, they were ancient, old enough to make my skin crawl, old enough to make my thoughts stumble. They spoke of something hidden, something forgotten. And it wasn't just the marks on the ground that unsettled me. No, it was the air around me. The silence that had fallen deeper than before. The shadows that now seemed to stretch longer, lean closer, as if they were creeping toward me. The trees above me groaned, their branches swaying as if caught in a wind I couldn't feel. I tried to step back, to turn around and leave, but my legs felt stiff, as though they were planted in the very soil beneath me. Then I heard it. A whisper. Barely audible at first, like a distant murmur. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was wrong. It wasn't just the voice of a person. It was something older, more sinister. I shouldn't have come here. The words were faint but sharp, like a warning. And yet, they didn't seem to come from anywhere. There was no one around. Just the wind, the rustling leaves, the press of the forest itself. But those words still lingered in the air. I forced myself to turn around, but something in the clearing held me captive. The symbols, they were moving. No, not physically. Not in a way that I could see, but in my mind. They shifted, twisted, grew darker, and as they did, something deep inside me stirred, a cold, primal fear that clawed at my chest. The air thickened. It was no longer just the trees that towered over me, but something else. Something that filled the space with a presence, a weight that seemed to drag at my very thoughts. I took a hesitant step forward, my instincts screaming at me to leave, to run. But my legs refused to listen. Instead, my eyes locked on the symbols once again, and the more I stared, the clearer the images became. They weren't just abstract markings. They were telling a story. A story of people, long ago, who had gathered here in secret, performing rites that were forbidden, that reached beyond the realms of the living. I could almost see them, shadowy figures kneeling, whispering incantations in a language that echoed in my mind like an unholy hymn. And then, I saw it. A figure standing just at the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, the way the shadows twisted and blurred. But as my eyes adjusted, the figure became clearer, taller, darker, its form indistinct, as though it were made from the very darkness of the forest itself. It didn't move. It didn't need to. The weight of its presence pressed down on me, suffocating me, as if it had always been there, watching, waiting. I opened my mouth to scream, but the sound never came. Instead, the whisper returned, this time clearer. "You've seen too much." And in that moment, I realized I wasn't supposed to find this place. I couldn't move. The figure in the clearing, the one I had thought was a trick of my mind, was not just standing there anymore. It was watching me. Its form was becoming clearer with each passing moment, like ink bleeding into paper. The shadows stretched unnaturally long, curling around the base of the trees, converging into the shape of a tall, dark silhouette. I could feel its gaze, though its face remained hidden. It wasn't just a presence, it was something ancient, something that should never have been seen. The whisper came again. "You've seen too much." The voice seemed to echo in my mind, drowning out all other sounds. It wasn't a voice I could place. It didn't belong to anyone I knew, but the tone, it was calm, almost soothing in its coldness. But that calmness was what made it terrifying. Like the silence before a storm, like the stillness of the forest right before it consumed you. I wanted to run. I needed to run. But my legs felt like lead. The fear in my chest was paralyzing. It was as if the very air around me had thickened, held me in place. My breaths came out in short, shallow gasps, my eyes locked on the dark figure. It didn't move closer, but I could feel its presence pressing in on me, filling the clearing with an oppressive weight. For what felt like an eternity, we stood in this deadlock, the figure and I, neither of us making a move. The silence in the woods had deepened. Even the wind had stopped, the trees standing still as though afraid to stir. But then, as if some unseen force had snapped the tension, the whisper came again, louder this time. "It's time." That was when the ground beneath me began to shift. At first, it was a faint vibration, barely perceptible, as though the earth itself was trembling. Then, the ground cracked open, a deep, jagged rift splitting the soil wide. From the dark void, something began to emerge. I couldn't see it clearly at first. But the sound, the low, guttural groan that came from the rift, was unmistakable. Something alive was moving beneath the earth, something vast and ancient. The very air was thick with the stench of decay, of earth long untouched by light. I tried to scream, to move, but my body refused to obey. My mind screamed for escape, but my feet were rooted to the spot. The shadows around me began to twist and writhe, spiraling like smoke being sucked into the rift, pulling the trees closer to the opening. And then I saw it. A hand, no, claw, reached up from the darkness, its fingers twisted, long, and ending in sharp, jagged talons. It scraped against the edges of the rift, pulling itself free. The figure in the clearing seemed to grow taller as the hand emerged, the darkness around it growing more intense. I wanted to close my eyes, to look away, but something forced me to watch. I couldn't tear my gaze from the opening, from the shape that was slowly pulling itself out. And then I realized the figure, the dark presence I had seen earlier, was not a man. It was something far worse. Something that had been waiting, buried in the depths of the forest, for me to find it. The clawed hand pulled itself free, followed by a second one, and then a massive, shifting body began to emerge, its form still shrouded in shadow. It was humanoid in shape, but its features were grotesque, a terrifying distortion of the human form. Its skin, if you could call it that, was mottled and slick, as if it were made from the very dirt and darkness around it. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, each beat louder than the last, as the creature slowly pulled itself free from the rift. Its eyes, two glowing embers of molten gold, fixed on me with a malevolent, predatory gaze. There was no mercy in those eyes, no understanding, only the hunger that came with something ancient and primal. "You shouldn't have come here," the whisper came again, but now it felt like it was coming from the creature itself, from the very ground beneath me. "Now you belong to us." It was too much. The sight, the sound, the overwhelming sense of doom. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I was trapped in the clearing, the creature's gaze paralyzing me with its intensity. And then, as if driven by instinct I couldn't control, my legs moved. Not willingly, but as though some invisible force was guiding them. I didn't run, but I was drawn closer to the rift, to the thing that was emerging from the darkness. I reached the edge of the clearing. My breath caught in my throat as I looked down at the symbols etched into the ground. They were glowing now, pulsating with a dark energy that seemed to hum with life. The creature was almost free, its massive body now fully exposed, and the ground beneath me seemed to open even further, widening into an abyss that threatened to swallow me whole. I felt it then, the pull. It wasn't just a rift. It was something within me, something that had been awakened by my discovery. I needed to step closer, to be drawn into that abyss, to give into whatever ancient force it was that had waited for me. And as I stepped forward, the world around me blurred, fading into the blackness of the rift, my body no longer my own. I wasn't just trapped in the forest. I was part of it now. I don't know why I closed my eyes, or when I lost all sense of the world around me. The last thing I remember was stepping closer to the rift, the strange pull that seemed to come from the ground itself, and then darkness. The kind that doesn't fade when you blink, the kind that fills your lungs, making it impossible to breathe. I opened my eyes, or at least, I think I did. Everything was black. No light. No sound. Just the heavy, suffocating silence pressing against me from every side. My heart was racing, but my body felt heavy, like I was trapped in some thick, invisible liquid. I couldn't move, couldn't even feel my limbs. And then, a noise. A whisper. "Welcome." The voice was closer now, but there was no shape to it. It didn't come from any direction, didn't seem to have a source. It simply was. It surrounded me, filled me, like a sound that was a physical presence. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my mouth. I wanted to ask where I was, what I was, but the question was swallowed by the silence before it ever left my mind. The darkness began to shift. At first, it was subtle, a movement at the edge of my vision, too faint to be certain of. But soon, shapes began to form. At first, they were just fleeting outlines, shadows dancing on the periphery of my awareness. But then, those shapes solidified, becoming more defined, more real. Figures. Tall and twisted. Their forms were like distorted versions of human bodies, but there was nothing human about them. Their limbs stretched unnaturally long, their faces hidden behind masks of shadow, but their eyes, those eyes, burned through the darkness, glowing with that same molten gold. I tried to back away, but there was no space. No distance. I was stuck in this place, this realm, if that's what it even was, caught between something alive and something dead, and the creatures were closing in. They moved soundlessly, gliding over the ground like smoke, their heads tilting at odd angles as they watched me with that terrible, unblinking gaze. "You're here now," the voice whispered, "and there is no going back." I tried to focus, tried to remember what brought me here, tried to think of anything but the figures closing in on me. But my mind was a tangled mess of confusion. How had I gotten here? What was this place? Why couldn't I move? I tried to breathe, to focus on the real world, the one I knew, the one I should be in. But the more I fought to break through the darkness, the more everything around me seemed to slip away. The space around me felt wrong, as though reality itself was being warped, bent into a shape I didn't recognize. "We are your shadow," the voice whispered again, "and you are ours." A sudden chill swept through me, sharp like ice. It wasn't just the temperature, it was something deeper, something that reached into my bones, into my soul. I could feel it pulling at me, stretching me thin. I had no control anymore, no agency in this place. Whatever this was, I was at its mercy. The creatures, those twisted shapes, began to circle me, drawing closer, their eyes never leaving mine. Their movements were so slow, so deliberate, like they were savoring the moment, savoring me. I could feel their presence in the air, pressing against me, choking me. Each breath I took seemed harder than the last, the air thick and suffocating. "Do you understand now?" The voice echoed, louder this time, reverberating through every inch of my body. "You were never meant to escape." The ground beneath me shifted again, this time more violently. The shapes around me pressed in, closer, their outlines becoming more distinct, their forms growing larger. I couldn't focus on their details, couldn't think straight. My mind was spinning, dizzy from the weight of it all. And then, I saw it. A flicker of movement. Not from the creatures, but from the darkness itself. A shape, shifting and writhing, something darker than everything around me. It was as if the very fabric of the world was tearing apart, revealing what lay underneath. A crack in reality itself. Through the crack, I saw it, the thing that had been watching me, the one that had called me here. The being that had been pulling at the very edges of my mind. It was waiting for me. A shadow, vast and incomprehensible, stretching out across the void. Its eyes, those same molten golden eyes, were everywhere. They were in the air, in the ground, in the corners of my mind. And the moment I locked eyes with it, I knew I was lost. There was no escape. It had already claimed me. "You belong to us," the voice said, this time with finality. "You have always belonged to us." I tried to scream, but nothing came out. I tried to move, to fight, but my body wouldn't respond. I was already part of it, part of the darkness that had been waiting for me. And then, everything went quiet. For a moment, there was nothing but stillness. No sound, no movement. No creature. Just nothing. But it wasn't over. It had only just begun. I don't know how much time passed. Seconds? Hours? It didn't matter. Time had become as unreliable as everything else in this place. The silence wrapped around me like a suffocating shroud, pressing down on me with the weight of 1,000 forgotten memories. I couldn't tell if I was still breathing or if my heart was still beating. The stillness felt wrong, like something had been stolen from me, something I couldn't name but felt deep within me. And then I heard it. A whisper. Soft, like the rustle of a leaf on a windless day. But this was no ordinary whisper. It was a command, a beckoning, one that made every fiber of my being tremble in response. I didn't want to listen, didn't want to give it any more of my attention, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't pull away from it. Come closer. It was the voice again, that same voice that had followed me through the darkness. It had started as a distant murmur, but now it was clearer, sharper, as if it had somehow moved closer to me. I could feel it pressing against my skin, crawling inside me, wrapping itself around my thoughts. I could feel it weaving its way into the deepest parts of my mind, sinking its tendrils into my very soul. I knew, somehow, that this was the moment when I would either lose myself entirely or break free. Come to me. The voice was more insistent now. I could hear it echoing in every corner of my mind, ringing louder with each passing second. My feet moved before I could stop them. I wanted to fight it. I wanted to scream, to run, to resist. But it was as if I had no choice anymore. My body was no longer mine. It was as if the darkness had taken over, and I was simply along for the ride. I stumbled forward, my steps heavy and uncertain, as though the ground itself was shifting beneath me. I felt a strange sensation in my chest, as though my heart was beating in time with the pulsating rhythm of the world around me, like the entire universe was alive and breathing, and I was a part of it. The shapes that had surrounded me earlier were gone now, but I could feel them lurking just beyond my sight, waiting, watching. Their presence was like a constant pressure in the back of my mind, urging me forward, pulling me deeper into the void. The darkness around me seemed to grow thicker with each step, coiling in on itself, twisting, as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling. The air was colder now, biting at my skin, making it feel like I was walking through ice. My breath came out in ragged gasps, the cold biting into my lungs with each inhale. And then I saw it. A flicker of movement in the distance. At first, it was barely visible, a shadow against the darker shadow of the void. But it grew clearer, more distinct. It was a figure, tall and thin, barely human in shape. Its outlines seemed to ripple, like the surface of water disturbed by something unseen. But it wasn't the figure itself that terrified me. It was the eyes. The same molten golden eyes that had burned through the darkness before. They were staring directly at me. I froze. Come closer. The voice echoed again, but this time it wasn't just in my mind. It was a physical presence, vibrating in the air around me, pushing against my skin, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. I wanted to turn and run. I wanted to scream. I wanted to break free. But my body refused to obey. I took another step. And then it happened. The figure moved. It was so fast, so impossibly fast, that it seemed to blur like a streak of black ink spreading across the night. In an instant, it was right in front of me, so close that I could feel its coldness, its emptiness. I could hear it breathing, or at least, I thought I could. It was a rasping sound, like something dying. Its eyes locked onto mine. And for the first time since I had arrived here, I felt the full weight of what was happening. The thing before me wasn't just watching me. It was consuming me, piece by piece. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My voice was trapped, swallowed by the vast emptiness of this place. The creature's presence was overwhelming, suffocating. I could feel it crawling under my skin, digging into my bones, twisting through my thoughts. "You belong to us," the voice whispered again, but this time it wasn't just a whisper. It was a roar, a sound so deafening that it felt like my skull was about to shatter. "You have always belonged to us." The creature's face was inches from mine now, its eyes so wide, so unnaturally bright, that they filled my vision completely. It was smiling, but it wasn't a smile of any kind I had ever seen. It was a twisted, horrible mockery of a grin, one that made my stomach churn, that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. And then, the world shifted. Everything around me seemed to distort, as if I was falling, or maybe being torn apart. The ground disappeared beneath my feet, and I found myself plummeting into the darkness, into an endless void. I couldn't see anything, couldn't feel anything, but the cold, the crushing pressure, the overwhelming sense of dread. And in that moment, I knew there was no escape. You were ours now. The last thing I felt before everything went black was a hand, cold, dead, and unforgiving, touching my shoulder. I woke to darkness. Not the kind of darkness where your eyes gradually adjust, but the kind that swallowed everything, light, sound, thought. A pitch so thick, it was as if the very air had turned to lead. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My limbs felt heavy, like they were made of stone, and my chest was tight, as if something was sitting on it, pressing down with unbearable force. I couldn't remember how I had gotten here, or why, or what had happened. But the sensation, the fear, was unmistakable. It was still there. The same cold terror that had gripped me before, that had twisted my stomach and made my heart race with dread. It was as if I was being watched, but by something not human, something ancient and terrible. A low hum vibrated through the air around me. The sound was so faint at first that I almost thought it was a part of my own mind, a figment of my imagination, but then it grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't a machine or a wind. No, this hum was like the whisper of something alive, something that had been slumbering for an eternity and was now waking up. I tried to move, to push myself up, but my body refused to respond. It was like I was trapped in my own skin, unable to break free. Every time I attempted to open my eyes, I was met with nothing, pure, oppressive blackness. It was as though my eyelids had been sealed shut, my vision stolen. And then the whispering started again. "Come closer." The voice slithered into my mind, just as it had before. Its tone was soft, but there was an edge to it now, an urgency that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "We have been waiting for you." I didn't want to listen. I knew better than to follow that voice. It had led me into madness before. But my body, my traitorous, broken body, was already moving. My limbs twitched, my fingers curled. I had no control over my actions. It was as though I was being pulled along by invisible strings, forced to walk deeper into the dark. The ground beneath me shifted as I stumbled forward. The air grew colder, and the familiar sense of pressure intensified, pushing against my chest with every breath. There was someone standing just out of sight, behind the veil of darkness. I could feel it. I could sense its presence, like a weight pressing down on the very air around me. "Don't be afraid," the voice whispered again, now almost too close. "We are one. You have always been one of us." I wanted to scream, to shout, to demand answers. But my voice, like my body, was gone. My throat was tight, constricted, as though I was suffocating on the very words that I wanted to say. The darkness seemed to shift, becoming more fluid, as if it was alive, stretching and swirling around me, responding to my fear. The ground beneath me was no longer solid. It had become soft and shifting, like sand. My feet sank into it with each step, making it harder to move, to escape. And then I saw them. At first, they were just shadows, flickers in the corner of my vision. But as I strained my eyes, they became clearer. Figures, tall and thin, draped in tattered robes, moving in unison as though they were one entity, one mind. Their faces were hidden in shadow, but I could feel their eyes on me, watching me, waiting for me. I couldn't tear my gaze away from them. There was something about the way they moved, so slow, so deliberate, that made my stomach churn with unease. Every step they took seemed to echo in the silence, each footfall reverberating through the air like a drumbeat. "They are here to guide you," the voice murmured. "You have always been meant for this." I tried to look away, but my head refused to obey. My eyes were locked on the figures, drawn to them by an invisible force that I couldn't escape. My heart pounded in my chest, every beat a reminder that I was still alive, still trapped. And then, just as suddenly as it had all started, the air went still. The figures froze, their motion stilled in mid-step, as if the world had stopped turning. For a moment, there was only silence, an oppressive, suffocating silence that felt like the entire universe had exhaled, holding its breath. I don't know how long it lasted. It could have been seconds, or it could have been an eternity. But then, one of the figures stepped forward. It was taller than the others, its silhouette looming over me like a shadow in the shape of a man. As it moved, the air around me seemed to warp, as though the very fabric of reality was bending in its presence. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. I was rooted to the spot, staring up at it, waiting for something, anything, to happen. And then it spoke. Its voice was deep, almost a growl, like the sound of gravel scraping against stone. "You do not belong here," it said. "Not yet." The words sent a jolt through me, like a shock to my spine. I wanted to ask what it meant, wanted to demand more answers, but the words stuck in my throat. "But you will," the figure continued, its voice softer now, almost sympathetic. "You will. All in good time." And then it was gone. Just like that. The figure vanished into the darkness, along with the others. The oppressive weight lifted slightly, but the silence remained. The hum, the voice, the presence, they were still here, lingering in the dark corners of my mind, waiting. The world around me was no longer still, but it had changed. The very air felt different now, heavier, charged with something I couldn't describe. I could still feel them watching, waiting, but I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if there was anything left to do. All I knew was that I was not alone anymore. And the worst part was, I wasn't sure I wanted to be. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.